fantastic local athletes. That's going to do it for us. We'll see you next time on BI Sports.
The proceeding was a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. To find out more about community access television, training, and volunteer opportunities, please visit shawtv.ca.
The Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and a year of change in British Columbia, and the changes continue. The legislature's back. There's a new leader of the opposition and a brand new House leader for the opposition as well. Welcome to the show, Mary Polak.
Thank you for having me.
So tell people what a House leader does.
What does a House leader do?
What's the job description?
Well, when a House leader is in opposition, a House leader is part of the script writing and production crew for what takes place in the legislature. Really, if you think about question period, which is what most people are familiar with, we're the ones making sure that we have enough questions to ask to fill our half hour, that we are ready with whatever responses we need for bills that come up. And of course, then there's also the estimates process, making sure we've got that all organized. Budgets. There's an awful lot that takes place in the legislature that really is determined. The schedule is often very much determined by what the opposition wishes to do. So my job is to make sure that that all happens as it should. And of course, work with the government House leader and now the third-party House leader as well to make sure other aspects of the House run smoothly. Just for example, you would have noticed that we passed a motion enlivening a few committees and striking another one to select the members. I approached the government House leader, said we have a few committees that really need to get going quickly. Can we do this? With the two of us working together, you can get that done.
And all the scheduling that goes on is, I mean, generally there's a little room right off the chamber that you close the door and you'll see the House leaders go in there and they'll work something out. There's some kind of a thing going on in the House, and in spite of the theater that goes on and sometimes the genuine anger, there's a lot of cooperation as well.
A lot of cooperation at that level, especially there's the official cooperation. But I mean, I know for my predecessor, Mike DeYoung, and for me, both of us have enjoyed good relationships with Mike Farnworth, the government House leader, and that continues. But it's funny you mentioned the little room. So this is the end of our first week. It's been a short week because of the Family Day holiday. So here we are, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I've already been in that room meeting with him, I think, 3 times.
Have you finished memorizing the standing orders yet?
Not yet, no.
That's tricky.
It is tricky.
There are procedural things you can do in the legislature. The opposition can use it kind of leverage. The government can outmaneuver you, but you do need to know that stuff at some point.
You need to know it because it's not like you're going to get any warning when something comes up, right?
Right.
The government House leader is never going to tell you about some procedural trick he's about to play on you. Mind you, if I had one, I probably wouldn't tell him either. The point being, you need to already know that. You don't have time to consult. When the government decides to utilize one of the features of the standing orders to your detriment, all of a sudden in the House, your colleagues on the opposition side are looking to you as the opposition House leader to stand in the House and advise why they shouldn't be allowed to do what they're doing.
How are you
make our case.
How are you getting along with the Speaker? You gonna get along with him better than we have in the past in the House?
I can get along with anybody that I need to. I don't think I plan to spend any personal time with him, but to the extent that we have to work together on things like LAMPC, I shouldn't use that. Nobody will know what that means. The Legislative Assembly Management Committee, things like that. I mean, can certainly do the job that needs to be done.
On Valentine's Day this week, we had a by-election to fill a vacancy in the BC Legislature, the one formerly held by Christy Clark, and the Liberals did pretty well.
We did very well, and I was so happy for Ben Stewart. Ben, really, really hard-working guy. Certainly, most people will know he did have that seat, and then when Christy Clark didn't win her seat in the 2013 election, he graciously resigned, and she ran for a by-election there. So it's pretty exciting for him because it's not just being elected, but coming back to something that I know he really, really enjoyed. We're excited to have him back.
And it's interesting. I mean, it came in the middle of this issue in the Okanagan over the government of Alberta's boycott of BC wine. So I guess he must have made use of that during the campaign. I'm
sure he did. And Ben isn't just someone who runs a winery. Ben's got a sharp business mind. I mean, one of the reasons that he was given the position that he was given in terms of trade in Asia was because he had such experience with that. So he really understands the business of wine making and wine marketing. So I'm sure that was an advantage to him in the campaign, but there were many other issues too.
Alberta's our second biggest customer for wine, so I got to think that must hurt up there to some degree.
It certainly does. From what I understand, it really hurts the smaller ones. When government talks about perhaps making more space on the shelves for wines, the smaller wineries can't take advantage of that. It doesn't work for them. They're in a business where those people that would buy wine, order wine, probably many of the people watching might be on a wine club where you get, a case of wine and a sampling. That's very popular across the border in Alberta, and to have that stopped is a real impact on those smaller wineries.
Were you surprised that the Greens didn't improve their vote up there at all? They got 13% of the vote last year in the general election, and they got about 13% this time. In fact, I think about a point less. Andrew Weaver spent a huge amount of time campaigning up there. The other Greens went up as well. Yeah. Are you surprised that it seems to not have had any impact at all?
I wasn't. Okay. Now, I'm never one to take elections for granted. I always used to tell people when I was running in any election, I'd say, I think I'm going to win, but I'm prepared to lose. And I always take that attitude into it. But just looking at the analysis, I just didn't see the Greens breaking through further there. I think they had peaked where they were. And so, it came out the way I expected, but I can't say I wasn't worried. I was worried because they were putting in an awful lot of work. I know they had some high expectations. They chose a candidate they felt was really going to be suitable for the area. He had some endorsements, as I understand it, that were unusual for a Green candidate up there. But in the end, they didn't make the breakthrough. I
mean, I haven't had a chance to analyze it myself, but the issue I would wonder is if the Greens are supporting the government, I wonder if they're so close to the government that, if people are going to cast a vote for the opposition, they're going to vote for the Liberals.
And that's where...
How do you choose between the NDP and the Greens?
What are people thinking out there, right? I mean, I know there are people who, in my riding, told me when I was door knocking, I'm sorry, Mary, you know what, really like you, but we can't vote for you guys this time, and I can't bring myself to vote for the NDP, so I'm voting Green. Okay. Those people are now pretty angry, because if they knew they were voting to keep an NDP or to create an NDP government, they probably would have voted BC Liberal. So it'll be interesting to see over the course of however many years this coalition lasts, what impact does that have on the Green brand? I don't know.
Well, you saw off the top of the show where there's a new Liberal leader, Andrew Wilkinson. We haven't really said that much about him yet. Last week on the show, Keith Baldry, Global TV, is on. And he had this comment about the challenge facing Andrew Wilkinson. Here's Keith.
Wilkinson now is in place, and it's going to be interesting. He's a very smart guy. He's a doctor and a lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar, just for good measure. But even by his own admission, he's got some work to do on the retail side of politics to sell himself to the average folks out there. He told me on the eve of entering the race that he knew that people thought he was arrogant and elitist and out of touch and such. And I think he has to work on getting over those hurdles to be a successful counterpoint to John Horgan. But don't underestimate him if you're the NDP. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's a very good communicator. And I think you're going to see the Liberals now finally get out of this slumber, these doldrums that the party's been in since that loss last summer. They've now got a new leader. They've got a new staff that was announced today. Presumably they're going to have different priorities and be a little more focused than they have been up until now.
Hit the ground running in 2 question periods this week, I would say.
I think so. I'd like to think so, given that I'm the opposition House Leader, but I think we acquitted ourselves well. I think Andrew did as well. I think he also showed something that he spoke about during leadership, which is that he's well able to get under the skin of Premier Horgan. And that is a part of question period, being able to stand there, deliver your message, and be able to put the other guy off his game a bit. And I think Andrew showed he's very good at that.
Interesting that he's appointed Michael Lee, who most of us don't know very much about him. He was elected last May. He finished 3rd in the leadership and could have finished 2nd and could have won it. It was that close on that key ballot. He's the new critic for the Attorney General's ministry. So you're seeing some change there, and the other one I wanted to ask you about is Diane Watts, the former mayor of Surrey. Wilkinson said on the platform at the convention he'd like to see her in the House. Do you see any sort of path that will bring her to the legislature?
Well, I know Andrew has reached out to her, and I know he genuinely would like to see all those who are interested in leadership then be able to become part of caucus. She certainly would be a new and different addition to our caucus. So we'll see how that unfolds. Of course, part of that depends on what Diane's interested in doing. I don't know if she is interested in running to be an MLA, but I know Andrew's reached out to her, and I'm sure he'll continue to.
And Lee, how do you think he'll do?
Well, he's young. He certainly had a very vibrant campaign. I mean, it was amazing the way in which he broadened the base that he had, certainly significant youth involvement. And those are talents of his that we certainly need in our caucus. And I think Andrew recognizes that. And part of being a successful leader of a caucus like ours is being able to look at the talents you have around the room, find ways for people to express and use those. It benefits all of us if we can find ways to take advantage of those talents.
One of the things that stands out to me sitting in the press gallery up above the chamber looking down is the degree to which the government represents a younger, more diverse British Columbia. And the opposition could use a bit of a makeover in general. I think, does Wilkinson not have to make that one of his challenges over the next 2 or 3 years to get a more diverse slate of candidates for next time?
It's always a balance that a leader has to strike, because on the one hand, you want to revitalize your party. You're always looking for new blood, new people. Yeah. But at the same time, you want people to do that on their own too. You don't want to be pushing people out. So it's a delicate thing to manage. However, I look at some of the ridings where we think we should be able to regain seats. Those are great places for newer, younger faces to show themselves, and I think there's some great opportunities. There's ebbs and flows in that too that are natural, that can't be controlled by leaders, and sometimes you'll see one side looking a little older and sometimes the other side looking a little older.
I said to a group in Vancouver today, I said, good Lord, some of the Liberals are almost as old as I am. This is let's go to Ida Chong, former cabinet minister, with a very good question for you about your state of readiness. Here's Ida.
As you know, minority governments can fall very quickly. All it takes is for someone to miss a vote or a vote being turned down. So, are you ready should there be an election in 2019 or even in 2020?
I don't know if I would have wanted to answer that question prior to having a leader. That was the first hurdle we needed to get past. You really can't build your party, you really can't build your team if you don't have someone that's going to be there taking the reins, and we really needed to do that. I think we can take it on anytime we need to. We're going to do better at it if we get a little bit more time. But I think we're all mindful of the fact that we have to be ready for that. I didn't throw out my election signs. I'm keeping them. So, you know, there's just some very practical things like that that I think we're all very alive to. That on the one hand, we have to be prepared. If this government's going to last for its full term, we have to be prepared to carry that through. But on the other hand, we do have to be ready whenever that gets called. I had a member ask me, a new member, well, my goodness, what do we do if, you know, there's an election? How do we nominate people? And I said, well, not that I've been through it, but, you know, cast your mind back. Before we had set election dates, that's the way it always was, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Government knew ahead of time, but, you know, nobody else did.
No, the opposition had to be ready. And the other thing, so you've got Ben Stewart will be back in the chamber with the return of the election writ, the results certified, so probably in 2 or 3 weeks.
That's what we're thinking.
And you've got one member recovering from bypass surgery,
yeah,
right?
Steve Thompson.
Steve Thompson. Yeah. And I think he's planning to be back sometime in March, right?
We're not going to count on that. I mean, he's doing marvelously. Good. He visited our caucus when we were in Kelowna, and we're so pleased that he's okay. I mean, you know, he's a much beloved member of the chamber on both sides. Yep. So everybody happy to see him recovered, but we're also telling him, don't push it. Yeah. You know, for heaven's sakes, don't push it. Stay away as long as you need.
We will all remember the member who came back too soon and died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
Not that long ago. Yeah. No, but in any event, by mid to late spring, the House will be back full complement on both sides.
Full strength.
So, yeah. Let's go to Mike Farnworth, talking about your counterpart, talking about the agenda for the session. Here's Mike.
I think you're going to see a very busy legislative agenda. Obviously, there is the budget, which will come down next Tuesday, and the budget bills that flow from that. It's also no surprise that we're going to be dealing with cannabis and all issues related to cannabis, and there's significant legislation as well around that. And also I'm expecting that changes involving ICBC may well require legislation. So it's going to be a very busy session, and I expect a fall session as well.
Yeah, he's been telling his colleagues that just the cannabis file, John Horgan teases him, calls him Ganja Guy, Minister for Cannabis. But seriously, he says 18 pieces of legislation for that. Yeah. They've got to do this ICBC stuff because they want the new caps in place next year. There will have to be budget legislation and passing the estimates. I noticed that because of the way the statutory holidays break this spring, it's only 11 weeks for the session instead of the usual 12. I wonder if they're going to be able to get through all of it.
Yeah. Well, I think he's got a plan to do it. Now, best laid plans, right? Certainly the biggest chunk of it, you've said, is the marijuana legislation. And I know even on our side of the House, those who are critics of various portfolios, it's not just Mike Morris who has the critic position for Solicitor General. It is a whole cadre of critics who are having to prepare for where they anticipate there are going to be changes needed. Yeah. Because you'll change the specific legislation that the Solicitor General is responsible for, but then there's a cascading series of bills that will also need to be changed because they all tie into it somehow. It's going to be a real challenge. I do think, though, not all bills garner the ire of the opposition either, right? So we'll see how many of those bills are ones where we are terribly opposed versus I'm sure there will be some bills on the docket that are not those that need significant amounts of debate. And of course, that's partly the job of the opposition, is to prioritize where we want to spend our time debating.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with Opposition House Leader Mary Polak. Stay with us.
The new leader of the BC Liberal Party, Mr. Wilkinson, has a habit of occasionally putting both feet in his mouth. It seems to me that we've already heard some very cringeworthy statements out of him, like he wants to make John Horgan's skin crawl, or he wants to drive a wedge in the BC NDP and Green government. I'm not sure that that's what voters will be inspired by from a new leader and the BC Liberals in the future.
You've landed on the right channel. I'm George Heyman, MLA for Vancouver Fairview, and you're watching Voice of BC, where you're going to hear great questions and the answers that you need to hear about the issues affecting you.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Providing my special needs son with the care he needed made it impossible to work outside the home. I felt like I had no choices. Make a Change Canada gave me the opportunity I needed to grow my marketing business with their online training and guidance. Now, I run Gale Force Marketing while still being able to be a full-time parent to my son and provide him with the care he needs. They helped make it possible.
Make a Change Canada is an accredited nonprofit organization with charitable status. Find out how they may be able to empower you with your employment challenges.
Now the BC Liberals have a new leader. One of the big challenges is going to be getting attention for that leader. Andrew Wilkinson is no doubt used to getting attention as a minister, but now he needs to face the new reality of being in opposition, and it's going to be really interesting to see how quickly Wilkinson and his colleagues get used to their new role.
Welcome back, and now a few words from the Premier talking about his throne speech this week. Here's John Horgan.
What we tried to do in this speech, and it's a longer speech than usual, was to put a little bit more substance in the framework that the government plans to pursue over the next number of months. And again, I'm pretty excited. It's an ambitious agenda, one that covers a whole range of issues, but I firmly believe that it's the responsibility of those of us in the legislature to do everything we can every day we're here to advance the best interests of British Columbia, and I believe that the throne speech adequately lays out an ambitious plan for the future, one that I think British Columbians will be comfortable with.
Looking over all the coverage the day after, and I try to see what, how all media outlets covered it, what stood out to me was the number of stories that remarked on the things that weren't in the throne speech.
Yeah. He can claim that it was ambitious, but if that's the case, I guess maybe you could say it wasn't as ambitious as their platform, because there are notable absences. Quite a few reporters touched on the absence of $10 a day childcare, and of course now there's some backpedaling going on the part of the opposition with respect to that being some sloganeering. 114,000 affordable housing units. The $400 rental rebate is completely gone from history. I'll be interested to see in the budget some other things that they have not specifically mentioned in the throne speech, but maybe weren't as specific about. So, for example, coming from the Education Critic portfolio most recently, in estimates in the fall, the Education Minister was sticking quite rigidly to the commitment to eliminate all Surrey school portables in 4 years. I was surprised by that at the time, that he was still holding to that.
It's a couple $100 million bucks at least.
It's oh no, it's well over that amount. Now, that's fine, except then we come to the throne speech, and then instead of it being the commitment for portables all being gone in 4 years, now it's become investment in new school construction, seismic. So I'll be interested to see in the budget if the money actually follows. I think we are about to see them have to back down from that commitment as well.
Well, the budget that we got in the fall, which included all the tax increases and some of the policy changes, was not balanced on a razor's edge, but it didn't have a very large surplus in it. So we'll see. Next Tuesday will be the test.
And the most common answer in estimates, all ministries, was, well, this is an update. Yeah. Wait till you see the full budget.
Yeah. And I mean, governments get a while to do what they want to do, and it's not uncommon for them to have to lower expectations, not least with their own supporters. But my sense with the throne speech is it was the first thing that the government has done where maybe the coverage didn't go quite the way they wanted it. So we'll see what happens with the budget next week. There's lots to talk about on that. The other thing that was interesting in the throne speech was what it did and didn't say about the struggle between the province of British Columbia and the province of Alberta over the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Now here's what the Premier had to say about that this week. John Horgan.
When it comes to the transport of raw or diluted bitumen on our coast, in our inland waters and our inland territories, I believe that that's a risk too great for British Columbians. We're in court right now on that very issue, and we will continue our discussions with the federal government and anyone else who wants to talk to us about how we can ensure that British Columbia's environment and economy are not affected by any movement of this product through our territory.
And we had a news development on this today. If you're watching the show live on Thursday night, the National Energy Board, which approved the Kinder Morgan twinning, today announced that Kinder Morgan, the company, is now authorized to go ahead with one of the most controversial parts of the project, which is tunneling the pipeline under Burnaby Mountain. A protest to wait. But this thing, the federal government's position is this thing is going ahead. And I think today's announcement is a sign that it is going ahead, even though the provincial government, I think, well, what do you think the real goal of the provincial government is?
I think it's broader than Kinder Morgan. I really do think that they are trying to deal with the various factions within their caucus, right? So they didn't end up cancelling Site C. That pleased their big Labour part of their caucus. They then had to do something for the environmental activists who are very much a part of their caucus and their support. I think that is the Kinder Morgan piece. And then if you look at the third leg of the stool, I guess, it would be all the many announcements that we've seen that take government in a much more social activist role insofar as how they deal with families and with people in their everyday lives. A notable line from the throne speech was that it was up to government to transform people's lives. And that's a philosophical approach. So I think you're seeing an attempt by the NDP to make sure that the three factions within their party are kept happy, and I think they are going to attach themselves rigidly to the opposition to Kinder Morgan because they need to in order to maintain their bona fides for their activist friends.
The move against bitumen and heavy Alberta oil, the provincial government's threat to restrict the increased movement of that product through pipelines and through coastal waters in British Columbia, that was announced on the 30th of January. The Premier was in on an Asian trade mission while that announcement was made, and the announcement was made by George Heyman, the Environment Minister. Now, in the legislature today, during question period, the Liberals got up and disclosed something interesting that also happened later in the day on January the 30th. Shirley Vaughn raised the question, but I expect you know what it was. What's the issue?
Well, the issue is this. The announcement was made, as you said, over the course of the 29th, 30th, and 31st, there was a retreat being held on Bowen Island, and it involved very many representatives from environmental activist groups. And what were they meeting about? Well, they were meeting about strategy to block the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And George Heyman graciously attended dinner during that retreat, the very day that he made the announcement of the additional regulation to prohibit bitumen, or at least limit bitumen movement through BC. So very unusual positioning for an environment minister, especially when you consider that an environment minister is to be an unbiased regulator. And that could potentially be a tricky legal position to be in, too, if you're not careful.
The other thing that you notice, if you looked at the record of that day, is that the government made the announcement at 10 in the morning. Press release came out. Within minutes, a lot of the groups that were at the retreat on Bowen Island that came out with press releases endorsing, which suggests to me that they were probably given a heads up of what was coming.
I think if they already had press releases drafted, they got more than a heads up. I mean, I've been in government. I've dealt with the announcements where you want validators. Yeah. The only time validators have a press release ready to go is if you've given them the whole shebang. They've got it all. The part that's concerning about that is it doesn't appear that Rachel Notley did. It doesn't appear that the feds did. Now, Mr. Heyman says that he certainly spoke to them about it, but it certainly doesn't appear as though they were advised with the same speed as, or at least the same preview kind of quality as as his supporters were.
Jordan Bateman from Langley. I don't know if he comes from your corner of Langley.
He's actually in my riding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, he's got a question for you. Here's Jordan.
Do you believe that the John Horgan government is violating the Canadian Constitution with all these stall tactics trying to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline?
Yes, I do. And I say that as a former environment minister. As you can appreciate, and I know you know the history, maybe some of the people watching don't, but at the time, we put forward 5 conditions that we wanted the federal government to meet, and others. The conditions applied to various. It took an awful lot of pulling at the threads of the different legal pieces to be able to sort out what we could do and what we couldn't. And then in the court case that the minister today referenced in the House, he took a small piece out of it, but it was a court case that resulted in British Columbia having to provide its own separate environmental assessment certificate for Kinder Morgan. In that particular judgment, the reasons for decision outlined the fact, you might remember, you did an interview with me on this, the judges outlined the fact that although we were allowed to say yes or no and allowed to place conditions, if we were to say no, because the federal government had already said yes, as a result of the Constitution, our no would probably not be of any force and effect.
Be trumped by the federal
Exactly.
government.
So even though we were required to make a decision, to render a decision, nevertheless that decision, if it was different than the federal government, wouldn't have had any effect in law. So there's no question in my mind that what they're doing is contrary to the Canadian Constitution. They don't have the power to do it.
But I hear the Premier on the radio this week in Victoria radio station, interview with Gregor Craigie. Gregor said, well, maybe the way out of this is a reference case. And the Premier said that's a good idea. It sounds to me like the British Columbia government would like to be taken to court on this thing because it would tie the issue up for some time. And if they lost, they could say to their environmental allies, well, we tried.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think the reason for this is the cold, hard facts that they deal with within their party. And having approved Site C, they've got to give something back. Kinder Morgan's what they've chosen. They may like it to go to court. I don't know how successful they would be. At the end of the day, you really are talking about a crisis. Maybe that's too strong at this point, but I think we're getting there. Wherein the Prime Minister and his government are going to have to decide just how tough they want to be on this. I mean, you can put forward a reference case. A reference case isn't an injunction to stop work. A reference case is just that. You can find out where you stand and how far you can go. But that doesn't help them in terms of delaying the project.
Well, a senior staffer to the Prime Minister told the CBC last week that you can't really have a reference case unless you have a regulation or a law that you refer. And of course, the New Democrats are threatening to do various things and saying they're going to do various things. We don't actually have a legal text or a rule or a regulation to take to court, and the feds are holding off for that reason. So the Premier did get asked about the missing $10 a day childcare commitment, and here's what he had to say about it. John Horgan.
When it comes to childcare, it will be the centerpiece, beside housing, will be the centerpiece of our budget next week. There's no backing away from anything. We are committed to making sure that we bring on more childcare spaces, we bring on more qualified early childhood educators, and we allow families to realize their full economic potential without concern or fear that their children are not being adequately cared for.
And again, in a radio interview this week, the Premier said that the $10 a day slogan was something that others came up with, advocates for childcare. He said the New Democrats adopted it in their platform, but what they're finding is that it is a lot more complicated to implement than they thought.
No surprise there. That was basically what we said in the election. And we had a very comprehensive childcare plan laid out. It didn't benefit from the kind of attractive slogan that $10 a day childcare is, but I believe what they're going to end up finding is that it's the type of situation where $10 a day doesn't work. You need to be building spaces. You need to be subsidizing existing spaces. You have to come at this from a multifaceted standpoint.
These references to licensed and unlicensed.
I was going to get to that. I'm actually really concerned about that. Reading about it in the throne speech, and then I was reading an article. I can't remember what newspaper it was in, but what interested me was they interviewed a woman who's running an unlicensed daycare in her home. And unlicensed doesn't mean that they are illegal. In fact, we have a process in British Columbia that they go through to be able to be an unlicensed childcare space. There's limits. You can only have 2 additional children beyond your own. And then there are some other regulatory requirements they have to sign on to, but not as onerous. Right? It recognizes the fact that here is a family doing this out of their home, as opposed to somebody who's setting up an entire facility and needs to have the right height toilets and the right safety equipment that you would need for a larger facility, and maybe the right width of doorways, etc. There's all sorts of different types of requirements for a licensed space. But the concern is, if you are going to then, I don't know, but it sounded kind of ominous in the throne speech, that perhaps part of the direction they're going is to perhaps force or strongly encourage some transition from unlicensed to licensed, and therefore maybe be able to fudge the numbers a bit on, well, look, here's the increase in the number of licensed spaces when really you've just converted them. I don't know, but the concern would be we can't, in the kind of demand we have right now for childcare, we can't afford to lose any of those unlicensed spaces.
Well, I would think if you were going to regulate them more heavily and demand more standards of them, it might not be economical for people to run them anymore, and you might lose spaces rather than gain them.
And that's the concern, and that was the concern of the lady that I saw interviewed, that if, right now they're able to do it in a very informal way. For a lot of those people who run an unlicensed place where, again, it's only 2 children beyond your own, many of those are people who know other people. It's not a business in the same way that you might picture a larger childcare facility. So a real mom and pop operation, if you want to call it that. So yeah, you put onerous regulations, they're going to think, well, you know what, not really worth it for me.
Another reaction to the throne speech, this time from the leader of the Greens, Andrew Weaver.
What really matters for a quality education is that the teachers in the classroom have the support they need to deliver the curriculum that's there. That, to us, is the #1 priority. We're going to be pushing and probing in that direction. Right? Where's the funds for textbooks? Where's the funds for teachers' aides? Where's the funds for children at critical ages? And in the area of early childhood education, we've talked about training again. The issue is more complex than that. We recognize right now that there's issues with respect to the wages that ECEs and childcare providers get. There needs to be some assistance there, and we're looking forward to those conversations.
Well, a press gallery dines out on Andrew Weaver regularly, and he will often say very, very stimulating things for us and for our benefit. Earlier this year, he was threatening to bring down the government over LNG. I don't expect that will happen.
He still claims that to be the case. We'll see. I agree with you. I don't tend to think he will. Possible. There'll
probably only be one opportunity this session to bring down the government, and that will be the budget vote, right?
Well, and that's the thing. People outside of our little tiny world here hear someone say, bring down the government, and it leaves the impression they could do so anytime they wished. Well, they can't. They can do that on a confidence vote. Confidence votes are very specific. If we voted on the throne, if we voted on the budget, and by the way, we don't usually vote on a throne speech, typically.
No. Right.
So he could vote against a budget, but I'm not hearing any indications he plans to vote against this budget. I suppose that's a question for him for another day.
And there's a thing called interim supply, which
yes.
tends to come up right near the end of the financial year.
It's a portion of the budget.
Yeah. It's a portion of the budget, and it's a supply of money, folks. That's how the government gets to spend. The general agreement is if a government loses supply, that's it. It's
that
an
is
election.
also a non-confidence.
Yeah. But he has signed an agreement not to do that, so I'm not sure we're headed for any of that anytime soon. I should just say, by the way, if you're tuned in from last week and you're wondering where Andrew Wilkinson is, because I said last week he was going to be on the show, he's busy. And Mary stepped in, and I appreciate it very much, so that's good. Let's get one more question in about next week, 20th, Tuesday, Budget Day. Here with a question about it, Jock Finlayson.
Shortly after the Legislative Assembly reconvenes, the NDP government will table its first full budget on February 20th. Back in September, the government was aiming for a small operating surplus. Since then, we've learned that ICBC will be reporting a massive financial loss of over $1 billion for the current year. In light of that, do you think the NDP government will actually report a deficit or a surplus for 2017-18?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think they would desperately like to show a balanced budget, first time out for an NDP government for quite some time. And of course, the biggest hits they took back at the end of their government in the 90s was around budget and all of those things. So I'm sure they desperately like to. Now, the question for Carol James, tough one, will she be able to balance and still keep the promises that they made? Right? I mean, that's the challenge. That's the challenge right there. The difficult part of governing is that you have to say no to some things, and we'll see if they've been able to do that. We'll also see if they've been able to come up with some ways to generate revenue. There's two sides to the government budget. It's how much you're going to spend and how much you're going to generate. The other danger zone is that even if they manage to balance the budget this time, what additional ongoing operating costs have they created for themselves, right? That'll be another challenge for them to look at.
So we get a budget for the year starting April the 1st and then for the next 2 years, so it's a 3-year budget. In my experience, when a government's getting ready to drop a surprise like a deficit when they weren't planning for one, they do put some warnings out ahead of time. I've heard none, so when I hear Carol James say she's aiming for a balanced budget, I'm assuming she'll deliver one. Of course, any balanced budget is always subject to auditing down the road, and the auditing happens a year later by the Independent Auditor General. On that note, we'll take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Andrew Wilkinson was elected as the leader of the BC Liberal Party under a preferential ballot system. He's since stated that had the election been conducted under proportional representation, one of the bad outcomes could have been a leader that was elected with only a minority of support. This is a mischaracterization of proportional representation, but it is exactly how our current first-past-the-post system can work. 19 of the current BC Liberal MLAs were elected with less than 50% of the votes in their riding. Something the BC Liberals think is okay for British Columbia voters, but not okay for their own party members.
Forget Mansbridge, forget Cooper, forget Woodward, forget Bernstein. For incisive, insightful, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism, watch Vaughn Palmer on Voice of BC. Thursday nights. This is Mike DeYoung.
Hi, I'm Darvin. I lost my foot in a lawnmower accident. Come on, come on. Today I'm teaming up with the BC Lions to tell kids to play safe.
Cool lion.
Thank you.
What does a lion do?
Run.
Jump. Tackle. Roar. All right, Darvin. Show me your roar.
Whatever game you play, play safe. A message from the War Amps.
It's always true that politics makes for strange bedfellows, and never anywhere more than in British Columbia. With that in mind, I welcome BC Liberal leader Andrew Wilkinson in the fight to keep first past the post and oppose proportional representation with me, a solid New Democrat.
I've got a question coming up on the proportional representation thing, so I'm going to hold off on that for a minute and just talk about a couple of energy issues that have happened already under the new government. Several of their bigger decisions involve that. We got a question about that from my colleague at Global TV, Richard Zussman. Here's Richard.
How do you differentiate yourself from the NDP on energy issues, considering the current government now supports the Site C Dam and is looking towards building an LNG industry in the province?
Well, they certainly haven't hurt our cause with what they're doing with Kinder Morgan, that's for sure. I think for most people, they understand the difference between a free enterprise government like ours that in the day was big time promoting the development of our resources so that we could keep creating those multi-billion-dollar surpluses and have more money to invest. They'll see it. They'll see what happens. You don't have solid support here. Instead, you have constant reviews. I mean, even Site C. You've got a jacked up cost for Site C primarily because you had delays because of the reviews that came out with the same kind of conclusions. So you certainly don't see any enthusiasm on their part, and I think the Kinder Morgan battle certainly helps our cause in making that differentiation.
What about LNG? I mean, the Premier went and met with all the partners of LNG Canada when he was overseas, so and talked to them. Clearly, he says he supports it.
Yeah, except Horgan hasn't moved off the position that he's had for these many years, which is a concern around hydraulic fracturing. And of course, they're conducting a review of that. Well, hydraulic fracturing is the way that you get the natural gas out of the ground. If you are not in support of hydraulic fracturing, you're not in support of LNG exports from British Columbia. It's an impossibility. So again, not able to make decisions. They'd rather review things and then rely on the review rather than lead and say, here's our decision, here's what we support, right?
Well, I will quote the Energy Minister, Michelle Mungal, on hydraulic fracturing, which is the natural gas we get delivered to our homes in British Columbia is produced through hydraulic fracturing. That's how our gas is released from the earth.
Gas. That's right.
Anyway.
They won't get any argument from me, but they keep reviewing it.
Let's go to Jamie Lawson at the University of Victoria with a question for you. And people, if they saw the comment from the Green person off the break, are set up for this, which is the debate in British Columbia, which is only just starting to get warmed up over proportional representation. Here's Jamie Lawson.
Come next November, there's going to be an important debate in this province again about proportional representation, something that your party has brought to the attention of British Columbians in the past. This time it seems like the BC Liberals may be lining up against the idea of proportional representation. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. How can you argue in favor of a government that has less than a majority of the votes getting 100% of the governing power? And isn't it possible that down the line, given how Andrew Weaver got along with Gordon Campbell, you couldn't make a deal with Greens in the future yourselves?
I hate to argue with a political science prof, but he's wrong. He forgets something very, very important, that the only people in that legislative chamber who are in government are the people in cabinet. What he's missing, and it's the huge value of our current system, our current Westminster system, is that each one of us in that legislature is a private member who each and every day gets to decide, do they support the government side or the opposition, or in this case, the third party. So it's not true that whoever gets the majority of seats gets 100% of the power. They don't. They have to negotiate with members in the House who decide to support the government side or opposition. Now, in practice, I know, people run, they align themselves with parties, but all you have to do is look to our most recent history with our now Speaker to see the tremendous power that one individual member has in our chamber. And there's lots of history that shows that. When it comes to talking about defending a system whereby people don't get elected with majorities, or could you make a deal? He talks about making a deal with the Greens and how Gordon Campbell had a great relationship with Andrew Weaver. Well, again, that's fine if you are satisfied with governance by deals behind the scenes, because that's what minority governments and governments with multiple parties get you, is that instead of the decisions of import taking place in front of the legislature. The decisions take place behind the scenes, and then you see the results in the legislature. And unfortunately, that's what you get. If you want to see that negotiating taking place between parties and the horse trading, that's the only way things get done in a minority parliament. And that doesn't happen in front of the cameras for people to watch.
Is the main reason the Liberals are opposing this because you expect that if we had PR, the Liberal Party would split into its Conservative and Liberal wings?
It isn't that way for me. And I mean, I would point out that here we are defending a system that resulted in us being in opposition right now, right? So not as though it's entirely self-interest. I look at it this way, and I should correct him on one other point. The second time that there was a referendum, I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves correctly, the second time around, MLAs were free to come out and oppose it if they wished. But both of those referenda had very significant thresholds, recognizing that you're doing something as significant as changing your entire voting system. The concern right now is not just proportional representation itself, but the very referendum structure. There's not going to be any kind of regional threshold. There's no threshold with respect to turnout. The threshold for passage is 50% plus one. So conceivably, a couple of major cities on the Lower Mainland could decide our entire voting system, right? But it's, I think the biggest concern is you give over power then to the parties. The parties then have the power to appoint members, and you've just lost what we have in a great democracy in our system.
One of the difficulties of talking about the proposal at this point is that what we're saying is speculative, because the government is consulting public, but it has not told us yet what will be on the ballot. They have hinted that you may actually get two ballots. The first ballot may simply ask you whether you want to stick with first past the post or go to a new system. And if you decide you want a new system, you've killed first past the post, and then you'll be asked from this menu of different kinds of proportional representation and preferential balloting and the lovely old STV thing that we all had so much fun explaining in 2009, you pick one of those and that will be the new system. So, I mean, we really don't know what this thing is going to look like. I presume at some point during this session that will become one of the things the opposition spends a fair amount of time talking about.
I don't know. I think they will have to. I don't know that with certainty. We certainly are anxious to see what they have in mind. It's another area, though, that differs from what they presented during the campaign. We were left, all British Columbians were left with the impression from them that it would be a similar type of vote to the one, the two previous referenda, where you had basically a yes or no. You had a very simple question. And instead it was made clear in the legislation that there's the opportunity now for this multiple choice. I don't know, Vaughn, if you've tried taking the survey.
Yes, I did. Yes.
I've had quite a number of people tell me they felt it sort of led you down the garden path to a certain conclusion. So that's a concern too.
And we don't have the rules, we will get them eventually. We don't have the rules for will there be public financing for the two sides, what limits will there be on campaigning. The Premier has made it quite clear that he intends to campaign for a change in the electoral system. How they'll level the playing field around the Premier using the power and travel of his office is, all this has to be sorted out. I heard Andrew Wilkinson say that his goal will be, once the session is over, to spend the summer getting the Liberal Party ready to oppose this in the fall. And he's suggested even using the $1 million that you're giving in public financing for the party to run that campaign. I don't even know if that'll be allowed, neither does he.
And nor do we. Nor do we.
So that's still coming. Let's go to a question about the way the Liberal Party picked its leader, and maybe we can go back and address the issue raised by some critics that you used PR to pick your leader. Let's go to Dermot Travis. Here he is.
I have to admit I'm a bit perplexed by how the BC Liberal Party goes about choosing its leader. 87 ridings, each riding equals 100 points for a total of 8,700. Yet, when you look at the results on the vote, you'll find 23 ridings had less than 200 members come out in each of those ridings. 2,300 points, however, more than half of what's required to win. Total members voting in those ridings, 3,600 plus. On the other side of the equation, you have 4 ridings where 4,200 members came out to vote, and yet they only represented 400 points. Do you think this is the best way to go about reaching some type of equality between the ridings and regions?
So it's not one member, one vote.
No, and first to answer his question, I think if you're going to have a system where people don't come together and vote in one place, then this is probably the best system.
The old kind of delegate convention.
Delegated convention.
Yeah.
I'm old school. I kind of prefer a delegated convention. I like the idea.
Those were fun to cover.
Well, and you know what? I think it's a great opportunity to get young people involved, people who haven't been part of politics. It's a fun kind of a thing. So many people in politics I know will tell me that's where they got started being interested in politics. But to look at the voting system, yeah, I do. And one of the reasons I do is because it recognizes that we're not electing a government. We're electing a party that is then going to go out and select representatives. You need to have a leader who can bring together ridings from all across the province, and each one of them is going to have an equal say in what happens in our caucus. So you need to have that kind of equalization, if you will. But it is not proportional representation. It's a preferential ballot. So it's not as though you have, for example, multiple leaders that will come out at the end. It's not as though you will have votes and then for nameless philosophies, and then they will appoint a person to represent that philosophy. You are narrowing down the focus of the party to have its support behind someone who has built consensus. And you see that in the second and third choices that people are giving as their preferred candidate drops off. So it's a completely different type of election because you're trying to find a consensus candidate. You're not plunking in party-appointed people who didn't get selected by the electorate.
One of the challenges, again, in reporting on this issue is the degree to which the various alternatives are poorly understood even by some of the advocates. The preferential balloting one fascinates me because I've seen many, many comments that the Liberals used preferential balloting, used proportional representation themselves and they oppose it and they're hypocrites. Well, when Prime Minister Trudeau proposed a change in the electoral system, before he abandoned that promise, he was proposing a form of preferential balloting. That's what he supported. And I remember very, very well that many of the people in the country who want proportional said that's not the same thing at all. Exactly. It doesn't produce a legislature that would be proportional to first round balloting.
In fact, it has no impact on it. Yeah. All it changes is how the individual would be chosen at the local level. And I would argue that in that case, you're looking for a different outcome than what you're looking for in terms of a leader, right? Yeah. You're looking for a representative and one who, once they are chosen, is no longer thinking in terms of party. They now represent those constituents. And as we talked about, they could choose to support government or support opposition at any time. Their role as a constituency representative is completely separate from their party.
We got about a minute left. You got a couple of goals, things that you want to be sure you get done this session of the legislature?
Oh my. I want to make sure that we win most of the days in question period. That's my primary goal. And I want to make sure that when it comes to estimates process that we have those ministers really having to be on their toes, and same with any legislation that they bring.
Yeah, I would say through the fall, understandably, the opposition was shocked at having lost power, and it was looking for a new leader. And the government was new, and it was a an interim budget, I would assume you're going to have a lot more debate on, we haven't even talked about the Insurance Corporation of BC legislation, some of the things that are coming. I would think that you're going to be busy keeping the government pretty busy. They may not be able to get everything through they want to by the end of May.
And that's part of the job that I have, is to work with my caucus to decide what our priorities are. Opposition doesn't debate every bill with the same vigor and at the same length, right? We make decisions around which ones we think are deserving of a longer time period of debate, and we'll see where we land. There's also opportunities for me to be talking with the government House Leader about how ambitious his legislative plan is and which ones does he really, really, really want to get across the line.
On that note, we will be finished for the night. Thank you very much to the new Opposition House Leader, Mary Polak, for coming on the show. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions.